This is the Ancient and Medieval History for Thursday, June 9th, 2022. This is the last lecture of this school year in this course. As we approach the end of the Middle Ages, and notes out, please, we notice an increase in innovation in Europe in terms of new inventions and technologies. For example, we have the development, which is going to be perfected in Switzerland, of mechanical clocks. Now, these include pendulum clocks, but they're also going to develop towards clocks that use springs and tension to keep time. Ultimately, it's still going to be a long time before we end up with a really reliable clock. But these clocks are getting closer and closer to it. And unlike a sand hourglass, these clocks can be used in a variety of circumstances, and there's a degree of precision to them that is not there in a sand hourglass. We've seen eyeglasses at use in the movie The Name of the Rose, and these are primarily magnifying glasses. So if you have trouble seeing of a certain kind, and you want to use the eyeglasses for reading purposes, they might be helpful. To this day, they sell cheap reading glasses in pharmacies. And they're not prescription, they're just magnifying glasses. So if you have difficulty making out the letters, you can buy some of those, and suddenly, you don't have to put your head right here to see what you're reading. This will improve, of course, over time as the science of optics is developed, as people get a sense of how to work glass so that it comes out with a consistent product, and how to grind and polish glass so that you can end up with precision lenses, which is what we use today. Before this, basically, slowly over time, most people went blind. They didn't go fully blind usually before they died, but it is normal for a person through the course of their life to lose visual acuity. Some people don't, most people do. So you end up with an increasingly blurry world. Yes?
What would people do if they were, blind young? Or not blind young, but, losing their vision at the age?
They would basically rely upon other people. They'd become beggars if they were alone. It's not a happy fate. But if you're in a family, your family will probably take care of you. But your prospects really, really, really do reduce. Sorry, just thinking about a former student back in Maine who was in the process of going blind at your age. And by now he must be totally blind. His family took very good care of him. Very nice kid. But he just had something that we couldn't cure that made his eyesight get darker and darker. Gunpowder's important. Gunpowder's going to change everything. Gunpowder is going to make it possible for Europe to take over the world. But arguably, gunpowder is only as important, and maybe not even as important as what I'm about to tell you. What I'm about to tell you about is Gutenberg's press. Johannes Gutenberg is a European inventor, and he takes an old idea, hundreds of years old, from China. The Chinese, around 1,000 years ago, developed woodblock printing. In other words, they'll take a piece of wood and they'll design some calligraphy letters, and then they'll carve out everything except for those letters. Now you've got a surface that is simply the letters that you want. You then dab that surface with ink, and you not attach it. You place it on, press it onto paper, lift it, move the print, press it on paper, move, press it on paper, move, redab, press it on paper, move, and you can make up to uncounted copies of the same page. So handbills and placards and things like that become easy. But the Chinese language, being a language of word characters, means that basically every page is going to need to be carved separately, and that's pretty labor intensive. What Gutenberg does is twofold. First of all, instead of using wood, he's going to use metal. Metal type is going to have a much greater precision and a much greater longevity than the wood does. The wood eventually breaks down. The metal, not so much. The second thing is that Gutenberg, with his movable type, instead of doing a whole page as one piece, is benefited from the fact that we use 26 phonetic letters plus a bunch of numbers plus a bunch of punctuation marks and other symbols. So instead of having a language that literally has thousands, tens of thousands of different symbols, we have a language that has fewer than 50, significantly fewer than 50, closer to 25 in terms of basically what you need. If you don't care about capitalization, if you do care about capitalization, fine. You've got about 100. That's still not bad. And what you do is Gutenberg developed a bracket. And onto that bracket, you spell out in reverse everything that you want to write. And you place the letters in order, and each line of letters has a little bracket that you screw on to keep them in place. And slowly you set the page, that's what it's called, typesetting. And once the page is set, what Gutenberg did is he would have this sort of reverse image, and he would be able to dab it with ink, and using little things like handles with poofs on them, and the poofs get inky, and you dab it with ink. And then you have a slide where you move a piece of paper, and there is a big screw, and you press, release, release, release. The typeface goes up, and the paper goes down, and then you bloomp and bloomp and bloomp, and you can make, again, countless copies of the same page until you're ready for a new one. In which case, you clean off the ink, and then you take apart your lines, and you typeset a new page using the same basic set of tiles of type that you have. And so with Gutenberg's press, instead of having to carve a page-sized piece of wood every time you want to print something different, all you have to do is invest in the typesetting, brackets, and in the pieces of movable type, in a rack that you can use as a printing press. This is what it is. It's the press. You're pressing the typeface onto the paper, and you're pulling it up, and it's now stamped with ink. And you can start producing ridiculous amounts of handbills and books. For the first time in human history, Gutenberg's press makes it possible to print books en masse. The first book, of course, that he prints is the Holy Bible. A Gutenberg Bible is one of the most valuable treasures on earth. Gutenberg Bibles are worth ridiculous amounts of money. But he made a lot of them for the time. In fact, the Holy Bible, in terms of a single title, is still either the most or one of the most published books ever. And I mean in the top 5, probably in the top 3, and I think it actually still is the top 1. Some variant of the Holy Bible. Most published book ever. But Gutenberg begins to print other books, and other people buy his printing press or buy his blueprints and designs. And soon printing presses start appearing all over Europe. This is going to change the mind of everyone. Up until now, the only way you would make a book is by hand copying it. The Romans and Greeks would have slaves to do it. The medieval period had monks to do it. But you had to hand copy books, which is a slow, painstaking, and time-consuming process. Slow and time-consuming, note I said both of those things. And it's also prone to error. You make a mistake, and what do you do with the page? Do you redo it? Do you cross it out? Do you draw a little picture over it? How do you deal with that? And if you're copying into a folio book, which is the kind of books we use, and you mess up on a page, you can't rip the page out. That'll destroy the book. So you got to find a way to do something. What if you miscopy a whole page? What if you put the page in the wrong spot? So hand copying books is really not going to produce a lot of expansion of books. It's going to preserve and slowly expand the number of books available. So what people would do is they would develop their memory with what are called mnemonics. Mnemonic techniques. M-N-E-M-O-N-I-C-S. M-N-E-M-O-N-I-C-S. Mnemonics. M-N-E-M-O-N-I-C-S. Mnemonics. I'm telling you this so you can write it down. M-N-E-M-O-N-I-C-S. Mnemonics. And what mnemonics are techniques for building your memory. I'll tell you briefly about one now. I'm sure I'll tell you about it next year as well. It's called the memory palace. If you learn a new thing, like the word mnemonics, what you can do to help you recall that information, because a good part of the problem with memory isn't that your mind doesn't hold on to the information. Your mind is actually a really good sponge for picking up information. That's what it's designed to do. But recalling that information reliably, bringing that information to the front of your mind so you can use it, that can be difficult. So what people begin to do is they begin to develop a visualized place to store their memories. So say I want to put the word mnemonics into the proper place. For me, I picture the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, because I used to go there a lot when I was a kid. For you, you picture a building or a town or a place that you know very well. Well, okay. I've got mnemonics, and what mnemonics are, by the way, the definition is techniques for recalling memories. Techniques for recalling memories. Mnemonics are techniques for recalling memories. Techniques for recalling memories. So I'm going to picture mnemonics and its definition as a little statue. And that little statue, how am I going to picture that? Techniques for recalling memories. I'm going to picture it as a fishing pole with a bucket. The bucket is the brain. The fishing pole is how you're recalling memories. There are better ways of doing it. It's just what I came up with. So I'm carrying this statue of a fishing pole in a bucket towards the American Museum of Natural History. I walk through the front door, this big canoe there. And this is not fiction. This is nonfiction. So I go up to the second floor, to the big lobby, up the second floor. And is this information history or is it art? Well, art actually would be on the first floor. Is it history? Is it science? Is it language and literature? Well, it's language and literature. So I'm going to go into the left wing, which is my language and literature wing. And mnemonics is something that I associate, well, it's a definition, so I'm going to put it in the big definition room. Mnemonics has to do with the mind. That's psychology. So I'm going to go to the psychology section of the stacks of books in my definition room, and I will put it there. That's not good enough, because the way I remember information is through historical context. So I'm going to take a second copy, and I'm going to go to the right across the lobby into the history wing. And I'm going to take this statue of mnemonics and its meaning into the room on the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, because I associate it with Gutenberg's press. And I'm going to place it in the room, the late Middle Ages and Renaissance, right next to Gutenberg's press on a little podium. So there's a picture of Gutenberg, and there's a model of his press in my mind, and I place the word mnemonics next to it on a pillar. And I remember it, and I walk out. I walk out of the Renaissance room, I walk down the history corridor, downstairs to fiction, and out. So the next time I need the word mnemonics, I can either go to my giant definition room, which I don't usually do, or I'll go into the history room and I'll go, mnemonics. It's late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. I'll go there. Hey, that's Gutenberg's press. What Gutenberg's press does is it kills mnemonics. In the Middle Ages, bards, skalds, troubadours, they had incredible memories. They could recall thousands, tens of thousands of lines of dialogue to tell their stories and tell their plays. And they could recall it accurately. Now, one of the ways they did this is by putting it to music. Why do you think epics are poems in olden days? So that bards and skalds and troubadours can remember them. It's much easier to remember something if you put it to music. Remember that the next time you're studying something that's difficult. Yeah.
It's like the jingles on TV, like, okay.
Exactly. It's designed to help you. It's designed to help you remember things. But that system of memory palace, while it works, is not necessary if you have a whole bunch of books. You don't need to remember it. Like in the third Indiana Jones movie. Well, didn't you remember it, Dad? Junior! I did have to remember it because I wrote it down! If you write things down, you don't have to remember. The wonderful memory of the bards became obsolete. And only a few people who are eccentrics keep alive some semblance of the old mnemonic arts. Now, the only analogs to the development of the printing press are the development of written language, the development of spoken language, and the development of interactive computers with all the audiovisual media that go along with it. Each time we did one of these developments, the human mind changed. When we developed the ability to speak, we were no longer isolated. When we developed the ability to write, we can organize ourselves and preserve memory. When we learn how to print, we expand knowledge. It's not an accident that the expansion of scientific knowledge that brings us to the moon and back happens in 500 years of having printing, whereas it didn't happen in the countless eras before that. Now, we have the ability, through interactive technology, to do things that printed books just can't. One of the things that is dying because stupid teachers are letting it is the ability to write well with your hand. Penmanship. Well, why teach people how to write in cursive? They're just going to be typing everything. You morons! Not everyone has a typewriter everywhere near them. And the ability to write things is actually good for the development of your mind and your hand-eye coordination. Well, they won't need it. By that logic, you don't need any education at all. All you need is a frickin' iPhone. Well, what does meaning mean? Beep, 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 beep. God help you if you can't spell it. No, actually, it'll be visual. Meaning. Siri, Alexa, Sir Alexa, tell me what meaning means in simple words. Because why would we need to develop an intellectual independence when all we have to do is plug into the knowledge?
Because it's cool to impress people.
It is. Also, there's a difference between having a mind capable of evaluating on the basis of stuff that you know, as opposed to slavishly bowing before the tech lords and their products. Yeah.
I like to go on Google and look up random words like as definitions, and then like with like bigger words, it's like super elegant language in like the people also ask area, like people asking what things mean.
Mhm.
But if I ask like really stupid like 2-syllable words, then it's something like what this means.
Yes. Me tell you now. This means bird. What kind of bird? Blue. Blue bird. Yeah.
Do you know how many schools are actually teaching like cursive now? It's,
Relatively few.
yeah, I think it. I don't know if it's very.
Again, I've had this talk with elementary school teachers. I don't understand elementary school teachers. There's a basic difference in our psychology. And they're like, oh, you just have this fancy knowledge that nobody needs. I know how to remember stuff for the moment until God takes that away, and I'm going to use it. And that's what people do. Yeah.
For the whole cursive thing, so when I went to my elementary school, I had to learn to write cursive, and we had to write cursive for like the entire rest of the time there. My brothers who are going there now are like, yeah. So my youngest, he's in 5th grade right now.
Mm-hmm.
He never had to learn cursive.
You have to be able to sign your name though, because otherwise.
You can say
You can just put an X.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or your initials. And that's
Well,
So what we're doing is we're returning to pre-literate times. Make your mark. Ugh. Yeah.
I was only taught the lowercase ones because they stopped teaching cursive. Like,
Okay. I'm telling you, there's going to come a point where the power will go out and where you will be on your own in terms of what you know how to do. As it is, I am less competent than the generation before me because I could rely on technology in certain respects, but it's getting worse. I swear to God, smart machines make stupid people. Anyway, Gutenberg's press changes everything. And it's going to make the Protestant Reformation and the scientific revolution possible. Okay, I'll go quickly through. New intellectualism in Europe includes something called Occam's razor. Now, have your science teachers told you Occam's razor? Have your logic teachers told you? Okay, write it down. Occam's razor is the principle that if you have a bunch of equally plausible explanations, the simplest is probably correct. If you have a bunch of equally plausible explanations, the simplest is probably correct. If you have a bunch of equally plausible explanations, the simplest is probably correct. That's Occam's razor. Believe it or not, it's usually true. Not always, but usually the simplest explanation tends to be correct. Nature doesn't usually needlessly complicate things. Another thing that happens, which is going to make the scientific revolution possible, is the revival of the knowledge of Aristotle and his philosophy. The Middle Ages are deeply rooted in Plato's ideas, which is archetypes and imagining a perfect world and all sorts of stuff like that. But in the late Middle Ages, a number of Aristotle's books are recovered, either from Arab stocks or they're rediscovered in libraries. They become a big deal again. And Aristotle's basic principle is, if you want to understand something, don't do what Plato says, which is imagine it in a perfect form, interacting with other perfect forms and visualize it. No. If you want to understand something, observe it. Come up with a hypothesis as to how it works, observe it, it being the phenomenon that you're thinking about, and then make an experiment to test your theory, or to test your hypothesis. And you go where the data leads. You go where the evidence leads. If the experiment tells you that your hypothesis is nonsense, be honest and say, my hypothesis seemed to be right, but so I got to come up with something else. Or my hypothesis works. And now what I have is, does anyone know what a hypothesis proven by experimentation is called?
Theory.
Yep, a theory. Not a fact, not settled science, but a theory. It's a theory about how the world works. I had a hypothesis. I tested it. My experimental data says my hypothesis is valid. Therefore, I have a theory, which is a provisional notion about how the universe works, which we're going to use until we find something better. Good science never goes, well, that's settled. We don't need to think about that anymore. Don't think about that anymore. Don't question science. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not science. That's religious fanaticism. One of the reasons, even if I was persuaded by the environmental movement that I think that they're a bunch of charlatans, is because they act like charlatans. They are not willing to discuss their ideas critically. They are not willing to discuss their basic assumptions. They are too busy trying to convince the world to adopt their policies. That is not science. That's politics. That's not scientific theory. That's dogma, which is a religious thing taken on faith. If my environmentalist friends were more willing to take out their ideas and expose them for scrutiny, I'd respect them more. But most of them don't. A few of them do. Most of them don't. Therefore, I think they're a bunch of nervous Nellies trying to convince people to think the way they do by any means, including trickery. But what do I know? The return of Aristotle means, bless you,
God bless you.
although he may have coughed, I don't remember. We are going to use Aristotelian philosophy, which is otherwise known as the scientific method. The scientific method. That's Aristotle's philosophy of hypothesis, experimentation, and theorization. Okay. Forget. Vernacular. Vernacular is saying and writing and doing things in the language people speak in the streets. Now, it used to be everyone spoke Attenlay, that is the language of Omre, Latin, the language of Rome. But things happened, like the barbarian conquests, and like the hyperlocalization of life and the breakdown of long-distance trade. This happens in the Dark Ages, and it continues somewhat abated in the High Middle Ages. So what happens is, even in areas that aren't taken over by the Germans and Goths and Vikings, like England, we speak a Germanic language. We don't speak a Romance language. Our language is more rooted in Anglo-Saxon, which is basically similar to Dutch, than it is to Latin. Although we do have strong Latin influences, we're a Germanic language. But even in the area of Romance languages, Portugal, Spain, Catalonia, France, Italy, even in those areas, they're not the same language anymore. Spanish is different from Portuguese, is different from Italian, is different from other things. The result being that you can't just go into the next modular and take a language. You got to choose between Espagnol and Frog Talk. Francais. Francais. I'm so sorry.
Sounds like a chicken.
Look, if I'm going to say Espagnol, I'm going to say Francais. In any event, the point is they're separate languages now. You tried going into Dr. LeBlanc's room and speaking nothing but Spanish. And if you understand Spanish, you'll pick up on some of it. Heck, as an English speaker, I'll pick up on some of it, but it's not the same language anymore. So what people do is they begin thinking, well, maybe this stuff that everyday people actually use isn't just a bunch of street trash talk, isn't just a bunch of gang, talk, isn't just a disgusting Creole patois. No, maybe it's a real language. So people start writing Dante Alighieri. Dante writes an incredible trilogy, Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, which is on the afterlife, but it's also a political satire. Several popes end up in hell. Oh, that gets him in trouble. He put popes in hell. He would argue they put themselves there. In any event, Dante and his Divine Comedy ain't written in Attenlay. It's not written in Latin. It's written in Italian. And in fact, Dante is a big shaper of what the Italian language will become. Dante sets the basis. He establishes the foundation of what will become the modern Italian language. Now, the same thing is done in Spain a bit later by Miguel de Cervantes. Miguel de Cervantes writes a book called Don Quixote de la Mancha, or the Honorable Quixote of the Mancha, the ranch near the English Channel. In any event, Cervantes is a touchstone for the Spanish language. To this day, people in Spanish-speaking countries read Don Quixote because it establishes so much of what will become formal Spanish grammar, vocabulary, and usage. Now, in English, we've got a couple of guys that do this. First of all, Beowulf is written in Old English, which is basically Anglo-Saxon, which is basically Dutch. Middle English, the language of the High and early late Middle Ages, is the language of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Now, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which if you haven't read, you will read at least part of, is the tales of several people going on pilgrimage from across England to the Canterbury Cathedral to pray and make a devotion. And they've got all sorts of people on the road. So what these are road stories. You've got the wife of Bath. You've got a variety of archetype characters. And you learn their stories. What's that look? Have you read parts of it?
Oh, yeah.
Do you not like it?
No, I'm just laughing because I remember in class we read The Knight's Tale, The Wife of Bath's Tale, The Miller's Tale, and The Dun's Priest's Tale. And The Miller's Tale was something special.
I have never read the Canterbury Tale in detail. I'll tell you, I'm an ignoramus in that regard. Is The Miller's Tale a bit saucy?
Just a little.
Yeah, it's like, well, there's a book in the Old Testament that's extremely saucy. It is. I'm trying to remember. Does anyone know the Old Testament book that's extremely erotic? The Song of Solomon, I think. Yeah, the song. And yeah, I learned about this from a friend of mine who's a Presbyterian minister. Just weird. So, okay, Chaucer does not write in Latin either. He writes in Middle English, the language everyday people speak. Now, this would be like if I were a school teacher in the Bronx, where I'm from, and I decided to go to the streets and learn the way the ghetto people speak, which I used to actually have some understanding of because I was there a lot. But my ghetto speak is from the 1970s, and the thing about street speak is it changes really much more quickly than any other form of language. But if I decided I'm going to meet my kids where they are, and instead of speaking in standard English, I spoke to them in the language of the streets. Now, on the one hand, that would seem like a good idea, because many of my students would know the language of the streets because that's where they're from. On the other hand, I would be selling them out, because I'd be ghettoizing them further. They might understand things better right at first because I'm speaking in the language that their families might use and that their friends might use. But I'm not preparing them to leave the Bronx. I'm not preparing them to leave their neighborhood. Each neighborhood has its own special dialect. I'm not preparing them to join in the wider world. My job as a teacher, as I see it, is to introduce people, wherever I am, to the wider world. And so if I didn't use common standard English, then I would be selling you short. Because instead of teaching you an important skill, which is how to communicate reasonably eloquently in your mother tongue, as used around the world, I would be teaching you how to function within the environment you're from and nothing else. And that's the risk that Dante and that Chaucer took. And that's not so much Cervantes. By that point, Spanish was a bigger language. But the chance they took was that they were writing in a temporary language that wouldn't last. It would be like James Joyce the great Irish writer, and his Playboy of the Western World, which if you ever try to read, hit yourself in the head a few times with a stick first. I'm not a fan of James Joyce, in part because he uses idiomatic English as spoken in his time and place, and he doesn't use standard spelling or punctuation or anything. And so basically every reader who isn't from where James Joyce is from has to translate it as they're reading it simultaneously. Not for me. Wouldn't do it. I'm sure there are a bunch of wonderfully educated people out there. Oh, and just so I satisfy the women's the requirement that I had when I was writing this, there was a woman named Christine de Pizan who wrote a book called The Book of the City of Ladies, which is also written in vernacular. Talked about medical schools already. Again, I'm not talking about the art. Okay. Heading towards Renaissance. The word Renaissance, as you will learn next year, is usually said Renaissance. But I'm a pretentious guy who occasionally likes to hear the sound of I always like to hear the sound of my own voice. And as such, sometimes I like to use archaicisms and other weird pronunciations. And in college, I picked up the habit of saying Renaissance rather than Renaissance. And therefore, I'm going to call it Renaissance. It's like I call the Caribbean Sea Caribbean sometimes, just because that's the way I originally learned it. But I say Caribbean now most often. In any event, this is what Renaissance means, and you might want to write it down. Renaissance. It should be there in your notes, actually. It says towards Renaissance. That's item 4A, towards Renaissance. Renaissance is a rebirth of the ancient knowledge in a Christian context. The rebirth of the ancient knowledge in a Christian context. The rebirth of the ancient knowledge in a Christian context. So, what is the ancient knowledge? Well, the ancient knowledge is the pagan knowledge of Greece and Rome and the stuff before that. The stuff we covered in ancient history. That's the ancient knowledge. The works of Plato and Aristotle, the works about Socrates, Oedipus by Sophocles, and The Birds by Aristophanes, and Eratosthenes' experiments and all that stuff. That's the ancient knowledge. And it was produced by, for the most part, pagans. But now, this knowledge is being rediscovered as Spanish libraries of the Muslims are being captured by Spanish Christian knights and translated, and as the Arab knowledge is flowing into northern Italy because of the trade that's going there, the ancient knowledge is being rediscovered. And because it's being rediscovered by Christians, it's not going to be seen the same way. Look, if you, when you're in third grade, have an art project where you produce, we used to make things out of clay. I don't know if you ever did in art class, we did. And sometimes it was an ashtray because it was good for nothing else. But if you make a statue of a lion, which I did, lion head for my grandmother. It's good. I thought it was at the time. That's the point. When I was in second or third grade, it was great. The lion looked realistic. I'm not a, I'm a fine amateur artist. But I rediscovered it around the time I graduated from high school. And to me, it was a different thing than it was when I made it. I made it as a child. I looked at it again as somebody who was leaving home and heading out to school. And I saw a picture of it when I was in my 30s. Each time when I looked back at it, it meant something different to me because I was a different person looking at it. In life, there's what you deal with, and then there's the you that deals with it. The you that deals with it hopefully grows and changes. So the you that you were when you were in third grade is different than the you that you are in ninth grade, is going to be different than the you that you are when you're 25 or 50. And something that you did in third grade that had a certain meaning is going to mean very different things as you look at it from a different perspective. The ancients had certain assumptions about life, the universe, and everything. Christians have very different assumptions. So when Christians read Beowulf, or when Christians read Aristotle, or when Christians read Cicero, they're going to get different meanings. They're going to react differently than the writer expects. Because the writer is a pagan writing for pagans, and this writer cannot anticipate the sensibilities of a Christian audience. So, Renaissance is not the rebirth of ancient civilization. The ancient knowledge, which was typical of Greece and Rome, is born into a functioning civilization in Europe that is Christian. And so instead of these ideas just replacing what had developed during the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, the ideas of the ancients actually take on new meaning. They have different nuances. And what is developed is, if you will, a crossbreed, an alloy, a hybrid of the ancient knowledge and of the Christian society that it's born into. It's like the difference between your father or your mother and you. You are neither your father nor your mother, for better or worse. You are a blending of the two. You are an alloy of the two. And this is what happens. The Renaissance, which is what we're going to study next fall, is the blending of that ancient knowledge that we studied for the first 3 quarters and the Christian world that we studied for the last, and how they come together to produce something new and different. Just like you can have chocolate and you can have peanut butter, but you don't have a Reese's peanut butter cup until you smear the peanut butter onto the chocolate and then nom on it. If you like that sort of thing. I don't like it.
You don't like peanut butter?
I used to, but look, once every few years I'll have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on white bread just for nostalgia. But in general terms, I don't like peanut butter. Tina, my wife, likes peanut butter.
Have you had a peanut butter honey sandwich?
Yes, they're good.
They are really good.
They are good. When I'm in the mood for peanut butter on those rare occasions. Now, I do like peanut sauce in Thai food. That's different.
Yeah.
That's some good stuff. Okay. So now we come to the end. The end of the Middle Ages, and there are two possibilities that different types of people use to measure the end of the Middle Ages. Beginning of the Middle Ages, historians classically say Romulus Augustulus is killed by Odoacer, Roman Empire in the West falls, AD 476. Ancient times are over, the medieval times begin. But in the Middle Ages, there's the old-fashioned way and the new-fashioned way of looking at it. The old-fashioned way is what a classical scholar would use. Constantinople, in 1453, is faced by an Ottoman Turkish army. The Ottomans we're going to study next year. They're a modern Turkish army. And they've got heavy cannon. And the walls of Constantine, as much as they stand up to classical sieges, can't stand up to heavy cannon. So in 1453, after a long siege, the great city of Constantine falls to the Ottoman Turks. Hagia Sophia becomes a mosque. And the Greek world no longer has its capital. The Russians believe that the second Rome has fallen, and Moscow will become the third Rome in Russian culture. So, for a classical scholar oriented on the Iliad and the Odyssey and the works of Cicero and all that stuff, the ancient world ends, 476, fall of Roman Empire. The Middle Ages ends with the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453. That's how they would measure it. It is the end of an era. Constantinople becomes Istanbul. Istanbul was Constantinople. It's a song. And if I had more time, and I might, I'll play it for you because it's fun. But the other answer is the one that is most common today, and frankly, it's the one I believe. As important as the fall of Constantinople to the Turks was, in fact, when Columbus returns from his voyage of discovery, reporting that he has found a shortcut from Europe to Asia by going west, that's the real ending of the Middle Ages. because that is going to open up the new world. People are going to discover that the world is actually bigger than Europe, Africa, Asia, that there are 2 entire new continents and an entire new Pacific Ocean, and that Europeans will have to adapt themselves in order to sail the seas of this wider world. And they learn a lot by encountering the Aztecs and the Japanese and the Chinese and India and all the rest. So for my part, and most modern historians would agree, Columbus in 1492 is the ending of the Middle Ages and the beginning of modern times. And Columbus's voyage, remember, is sparked by the hunger for silks and spices, by the insistence of the Muslim marketeers in Cairo and Damascus to exact the Christian tax, which is, you stupid Christian, I'm going to double the price on you because you worship that Jesus guy. And this irritated the Europeans so much that they were desperate enough in Portugal to try to get around the giant continent of Africa. They don't do it by the time Columbus does. They do it 5 years later. And to go west to sponsor Columbus's journey, and Columbus thinks he's achieved it. So, any questions? That's it. That's the lectures for the year. Some of you I will see next year. I look forward to that. I'll obviously see you for the final exam next week, which you have a study guide for. Now, are there any questions before I show you a video? Okay. Bye.